I want you to visualise a woman who's been in an abusive relationship. What does she look like? Where does she live? How old is she? Does she have children? Does she live with her partner? If you Google violence against women, pictures will come up of women from various different backgrounds in their 30s, 40s, 50s, with bruised and bloodied faces. And this is what we associate with violence against women. And widely, we don't really think that it's that much of a problem here in the UK. 2 women die every week at the hands of their current or former partner here in the UK. And we still spend £40 billion on the end result of violence against women and girls here. When we talk about violence against women and girls, the "and girls" is very much the add-on, the forgotten part of the problem. Statistically, young people are most likely to find themselves in an abusive relationship between the ages of 16 and 25. So that woman that we were just picturing, those images that we see on Google, that's not what we conventionally connect. And the young women that are actually experiencing abuse, they're much younger and they're much more difficult to support. So young people start forming relationships around the 12, 13, 14 mark. But when young women who are between the ages of 14 and 18 find themselves in violent relationships, it's very hard for traditional domestic abuse services to support them, because we struggle to know, should we deal with them as children in need of protection or adults in need of safeguarding? When I talk about teenage relationship violence, I'm not talking about pushing or shoving or name-calling. I'm talking about high levels of violence. So a recent cohort of 183 girls, out of this cohort, they'd all been in abusive relationships, and they're all under the age of 18. 76% of them had experienced broken bones and internal injuries. So these are things that we would expect to see in something like a car crash, not in teenage relationships. And when you think about teenage girls living in the UK experiencing things inflicted by their boyfriends, such as fractured cheekbones, black eyes, and broken ribs, that really becomes hard to connect with what we believe about domestic abuse. Across society, we really struggle to accept that rape can occur in our intimate relationships. It doesn't sit well with us and it feels incredibly uncomfortable. Our perception of rape in the UK is incredibly outdated. We still believe that it is randomised, happens in dark, unlit alleys, and is perpetrated by strangers, when in fact, 90% of rape victims know their attacker. 90%. And this concept of sexual violence becomes really difficult when you start thinking about the fact that you're more likely to be raped by somebody that you know, somebody that you trust. And in relation to young women, their boyfriends, his friends, their friends. So in terms of sexual violence, it's grey already. And then you start exploring young women exploited by gangs, and it becomes even more confusing. Between 2007 and 2009 alone, there were 176 multiple perpetrator rapes in London. When I say multiple perpetrator rape, that's a rape that involves 3 or more attackers. At 176 over a 2-year period, that's 1 every 4 days in London. When you consider only 15% of rapes are ever reported, this really begins to show that this is the tip of the iceberg. I recently met a young woman who had been associated with the gang for quite a long time. And she was told, we need to do an initiation. We need to bring some new members into the group and we're going to have a line-up. So a line-up is where a girl is forced to go along the line and give oral sex to each of the boys standing there. Or she might wait in a room and they might come in one by one. And the boys told this girl that I met, if you don't find a girl, we'll use you. So she managed to persuade a friend of hers to be involved, an incredibly vulnerable woman. And halfway through, she decided that she didn't want to be involved in the lineup anymore, and her head was smashed against a brick wall. This was filmed and put online. And when people started commenting, they were saying, how did her friend put her in this position? Her friend exploited her. There was no onus on the young men in the group. It was very much on, how could this other girl who's her friend put her up to this? So you could argue that these young women are in a position of choice, that they choose to be involved. But when you're talking about gangs, you have to consider, is it a realistic choice to choose between being sexually or physically assaulted, or holding a weapon or performing a sexual act on someone who is threatening you can realistically be considered a choice? These young women make choices that stay with them forever, and it costs them anything from their well-being to their freedom, and in some cases their lives. Policies that are designed to tackle male-dominated violence in situations such as gangs sometimes perpetuate things and make things worse for young women. So in relation to stop and search, where the police can check to see if young men are carrying knives across the city, it becomes more dangerous. So it actually becomes safer to rape the girlfriend or sister of a rival gang member than risk being caught carrying a knife. So rape becomes a valuable weapon for young men in reprisal attacks. It becomes safer to rape, so it becomes a weapon of choice. When using sexual violence in relation to reprisal attacks, you leave behind less evidence, you still send a message, and the likelihood is it will remain unreported. So, if we want to support young women to make safer choices about their relationships, and we want young men to be able to form and maintain equal, non-violent relationships, we have to change our approach, because young people need to understand consent, coercion, and control. So, I propose that all young people over the age of 11, both boys and girls, should be exposed to compulsory sex and relationships education at different stages throughout their secondary school life. I've only ever been in one sex education lesson at school. I was 14, and the school nurse came and she put a condom on the banana, and it was incredibly uncomfortable. She didn't want to be there. Nobody in the room wanted to be there. And I'd never been sent out of a lesson before in my life, and never since, but this is the one lesson I managed to get sent out of. And now I do this stuff every day. I don't know how it happened. So, young people really are surrounded by sex. It's everywhere. But it's still not in safe spaces for exploration, such as classrooms. And when young people don't have safe spaces to explore something that's complicated, they turn to unsafe spaces, such as their friends, negative advice, and the internet. The approach does really need to be standardised, because all young people need to be involved, because they form relationships across boroughs, across cities, and more frequently, online. Unfortunately, I've worked with numerous young women who simply have no idea the seriousness of what has happened to them. They struggle to find services to support them, and they often never tell anyone what has happened to them, making them vulnerable and alone. Girls really are the forgotten aspect of the violence against women and girls conversation. But these are young women that live on the same streets as us, get on the same buses as us, and go to the school down the road. But society continues to tell them that incidences of serious sexual violence are either, at best, unlucky, or at worst, their own fault. Or unbelievably, we still tell young women who've experienced horrific things, no, this simply does not happen here. This does not happen in the UK. Statistically, over the last 7 days, it is likely that 11 young women will have been involved in a multiple perpetrator rape in London. That's 11 girls in 7 days in London in 2015. Maybe here in Lambeth, or maybe down the road in Wandsworth. So, sex and relationships education will cost money. I completely accept that. And all my friends who are teachers will continue to say, Izzy, do you not know that the curriculum is full? But when we continue to spend £40 billion every year on the fallout of violence against women and girls when it is simply too late, and we're still losing lives every week. We need to accept that we're not getting it right, and it's time to change our approach. So we need to think ahead, and we need to plan, because it's finally time to think preventatively. Thank you.